I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer for the San Antonio Marriage Initiative. I am so happy today to introduce you to Dr. Russell Berg. Dr. Berg's the Director of Pastoral Training and Church Development at the ministry To Restored in Minnesota's Twin Cities. As the founder of Russ Berg Marriage and Family Ministry, he's worked with more than 450 at-risk couples in his 45 plus years in pastoral ministry, including 21 years as senior pastor at Maple Grove Evangelical Free Church. Dr. Berg was a key participant and lead pastor in utilizing the work of the Crisis Marriages in Faith Communities Project, led by Dr. William Doherty and To Restore's founder, Dr. George Kenworthy. As a crisis marriage counselor and reconciliation coach trainer, Dr. Berg's led 500 participants to complete To Restored's faith-based discernment training. He's going to explain how this technique helps couples decide whether divorce is truly their best and only option, or whether there is any possible hope left for their relationship. Dr. Berg, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Amy. It's great to see you again. This is a real delight. So thank you.
Well, that is exactly how I feel about you. So I'm so looking forward to getting to talk today. So tell me about divorce ambivalence. What even is that? So many people think, they're unhappy in their marriage and they just want to get divorced. But that's not what you've really found, right?
Yeah, it's also called divorce indecision. And actually, probably 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, we used to think of the divorce decision as a long thought out, immovable decision. And lately, especially through the work done at Brigham Young University, where they actually studied divorce ambivalence or divorce indecision, they found that the decision is a lot more fluid and moldable than we thought. You wake up one day and you look at your spouse and go, I can't do this. You wake up another day and look at your kids and you say, I can't do this. And so you're kind of caught in not really being sure what to do. And it makes sense. It's such a life-altering decision that, having ambivalence is not only natural, but the really key question is who's speaking into your life while you're trying to work through that ambivalence? Because everybody's got their cheerleaders and their condemners. Where is there a calm, clear, Christ-like voice to help slow the process down, and out of respect for the couple, help them gain clarity on the future of their marriage?
Well, and that's kind of where you have stepped in, because you've helped work with a technique called Discernment Counseling that is so different than just the regular. We were just joking about how many people think of as going to counseling.
Yeah. I think before we started taping, I said, it's kind of like, at least Melody and I remember it when we needed marriage counseling earlier in our marriage. It felt like going to the principal's office, kind of like sitting on the bench waiting for the assistant principal to come out. And so.
But this is different, right? This is not a long drawn out process. This is not,
correct.
This painful going to the principal's office. Let's talk about what you've developed. It's kind of I think we called it triage, right? The pre to the pre.
Yeah, it really, so faith-based, the term that we use, faith-based discernment counseling, is actually a nuanced and studied version of discernment counseling, which has been functioning for a while in the secular therapeutic world. But Dr. Doherty and Dr. Kenworthy brought together a group of pastors, counselors in the Twin Cities. And for every 3 weeks, we would spend time together for almost 18, 19 months, trying to decide how can this be used and adapted for the faith community.
Yeah, because sometimes too, a couple will show up in the pastor's office, and the pastor may or may not have any training or know really how to best proceed, and so you have a whole kind of a process of something that's effective. Can you unpack it for us?
Sure. So as we're talking about pastors, part of the goal of the Crisis Marriages in Faith Communities Project was to develop an approach that is doable for the average pastor. The average pastor, most of us are not trained as we're not trained as therapists. We've had some exposure to counseling in seminary, but oftentimes if we're a solo pastor or we're in a smaller church, we are by default the marriage counselor. So it was designed specifically to handle the phone call for help, or the first time you're looking, talking with one of the spouses that's saying, you know, our marriage is struggling, what do we do? And then how do we work with that one spouse so that we can increase the probability of them being able to have a positive invitation for their resistant spouse to come in and begin to engage discernment counseling, which the whole process is really how it's helping a couple answer one question. Before we make an irrevocable decision, are we absolutely sure divorce is our best and our only option?
And how do you help? How do you, first of all, let's talk about discernment counseling and what it does. And then I'd like to talk about how you teach the pastors how to do that, because we got
Sure.
a marriage
Yep.
champion audience, but let's explain what it is you're going to teach them first.
Okay. Well, in the manual, we start by giving just some background and language that's used in the protocol so that people become more familiar with it. But then the training really starts with a scripted protocol. What do we do when one person either calls or we sometimes in ministry we call these drive-by shootings. You're walking up to preach, you're going to start a class, and someone comes up and says, I need to talk to you later because, you know, we're really hurting. And so in this initial call or conversation with the person who's reaching out for help, we try to limit it to about 25, 30 minutes, just because if we let it go on longer, just out of pain and out of, you know, practicality, they're going to start dumping everything. So we want to align ourselves with the fact that the Lord's here, the Lord's present, there's always hope. We want to acknowledge this person's pain without having to agree with their perspective on their marriage, because we just don't know. It's the first time we're talking to them. And so then you go down the protocol. It kind of helps a pastor either on a phone call or in person. You know, is this something that is acute or chronic? Is it something that, you know, there was an earthquake event, could be a death in a family, financial reversal, it could be exposure of adultery, any of those earthquake events? Or is this, sometimes we'll use what's called the balloon question. You know, if the marital distress in your marriage were a balloon, does this feel more like a pin pop, or does it feel more like a slow leak? And so part of this, part of this conversation then is to just kind of gently assess, you know, what's your motivation? How strong is your motivation to work on your marriage? How strong would you say your spouse is? What have they actually said about their willingness? Because sometimes when we're in pain, we make assumptions about our spouse's willingness to work, and we've actually never had a calm, clear, Christ-like conversation about where we are in terms of our interest in getting help. And then the conversation ends, and you know, along the way, we're affirming the person's pain without stepping into and agreeing with their perspective. So we want to gently tell them, you know what would be most helpful for this conversation is if you limit what you're sharing with me to what you're experiencing in the marriage, and don't unpack your spouse, you know, out of respect and for their dignity. If they're wanting to come in, we want them to be able to know they haven't been thrown under the bus in a private conversation.
Yeah.
So then we kind of move through this, encouraging them, just listening, affirming their pain, trying to get a sense of their motivation. And then at the end, before we close, we'll just ask them about the ask that they need to make to a spouse. And it could be their spouse is maybe already open, you know, both people didn't get on the phone, or oftentimes it's what we call a mixed agenda couple. One wants to save the marriage and the other is unsure. And so we want to coach up that conversation, that invite, because oftentimes when we're in pain, we'll come and make a phone call, or the pastor will introduce, you know, we've got a discernment counseling program. There's a discernment counselor in the area that we'd like to recommend. They'll, out of kind of desperation, they'll go to their spouse and go, well, we went to your counseling, you've got to come to this, or I found the silver bullet. We want them to go in the exact opposite. Rather than powering up trying to convince their spouse to come, we want them to go in the direction of brokenness and of fear. So it would sound a little bit like this. And I'll use Melody because Melody's my wife. But if I were asking Melody to come to the beginning of discernment counseling, it would sound something like this. Mel, I know that you are really unhappy in our marriage. I know because we've thought about it. You've even talked about divorce. I just know that we're in trouble, and I know especially that you're unhappy. I talked to a pastor who just gave me about 15, 20 minutes today. I was just looking for help, and I told him a little bit about me, not much about you at all. But I'm wondering, Pastor said that this program is designed specifically for couples like us that aren't sure about the future of our relationship. And, I think I'm sure, and I think you think you're sure about leaving, but I'm afraid. I'm not angry. I'm afraid that we're going to make a mistake. And with so much on the table, it would mean a lot to me if you would just come one time and just listen to the approach, and then you and I can decide whether it's for us. So, woven through the coach up in the language is not coercion. It's not asking the person to power up and convince your spouse to come in. It's really inviting them through your own fear and your own brokenness to say, our marriage is in trouble. I don't know what the future is, but I'm wondering if really we need some wisdom and some guidance where both of our viewpoints are going to be heard and respected. And so, then sometimes we also coach the spouse up to go, this is a lot to think about. If your spouse has been thinking and planning about divorce, you may need to give them emotional and spiritual space, time for the Holy Spirit to work. So don't be devastated if they go, no, I'm done. Then you just come back very gently and prayerfully and say, well, I understand this is hard for us even to talk about, but would you think about it? And could we maybe talk about it in a week? Because one of the things that generally happens, one of the dynamics of the leaning out spouse, they're expecting to be coerced. They're expecting to be forced to stay in the marriage. They're expecting to be, condemned a lot of times in the church. Some of it's in their own head, but, and so we want to try to go in the opposite direction to try to disarm that resistance if at all possible. So that's kind of what we do, the purpose of the phone call. Then, assuming that both husband and wife come in, I will sit down with them and first of all, I'll just get a little bit of information about them. Tell me where you guys work. Tell me how you met. What are the names and ages of your children if you have children? And then I'll ask them something like this. If it's appropriate before this, if they're open to it, I always, offer a word of prayer. And sometimes even Christians are not. I've had some Christians that, and I appreciate their honesty. They go, please do not pray right now. God and I are not on speaking terms. So, hey, you know what? I can appreciate it. Thank you for being honest. But then I'll ask them, and especially I want to, in an appropriate way, demonstrate deference to the person that's leaning out. And so if Melody were the leaning out wife, I would say something like this to her. Melody, I just want you to know, as a reconciliation coach, as a pastor, I know this must be incredibly hard for you to come to a meeting you didn't want to have. And I just want you to know, regardless of what comes out of our meeting, I want you to know I see the courage that it took for you to be here, and I want to thank you. Then we'll just ask them, what would you hope to take away? and you just receive whatever that is. Sometimes people have a very, well, I just want closure. Okay, you don't challenge any of that. I'm letting this couple, and actually I'm letting two spouses, and this may happen at very different times. I'm letting them sniff around. I'm letting them decide whether or not this is going to be a safe conversation. And then when they tell me a little bit about their goals, and here's what I would hope to take away, I would just explain to them the process. Here's what we're going to do. This is not like traditional counseling. Traditional counseling oftentimes is very non-directive, and we understand that's appropriate in certain schools of counseling. But we want to be very clear about wanting to guide you through a set of conversations to help you have discernment about your marriage. And so I'll do a little bit of setup with saying, please understand, you're going to say things and hear things that you don't agree with. Your spouse is going to be sharing their story. Please understand, I want all of that. Don't feel the need to correct your spouse. Don't feel the need to fill in a blank. You're both going to hear things that are maybe going to trigger you. And I know that you'll do your best, but it's really important for me to hear through your own voice what's happened to your marriage to bring you to the place where you're in so much pain. Would you like me to walk through? Do you want to ask a few more questions? Or
oh my gosh, when the way you present this, Dr. Berg, I just can feel, as a person sitting, I'm sure that our marriage champions can just feel that they have sat with couples, and I just feel your love and your compassion for the couples that have sat in front of you. But I can also feel this incredible competency. You really, really know what you're doing, and you can teach others to be empowered to also know. So yes, I would like you now to go ahead and explain how you work through this with a couple, because you are just casting such a vision for so many of our marriage mentors and our champions and our pastors who are watching, because you do this in such a beautiful and skillful way. Your language is just amazing.
Feel free, Amy, to push the pause button if something's not clear, because I talk about this all the time. And so sometimes I
think you are really casting a vision and just really modeling how this can work so beautifully.
One of the things that you reflected back to me, and I appreciate it, I'm not always aware of it, because this work with conflicted, ambivalent couples, this work with mixed agenda is really hard. It's hard on your heart. It's hard on your mind. You're going to have couples that are going to wade in halfway to the process, and they're going to pull the ripcord anyway. You feel sometimes like you're 10 feet from the falls trying to grab. And what's interesting to me is that, pastors, we're really called to the ministry of reconciliation. So for so many men and women who are in this marriage space that are not professional counselors, they will do this. This will resonate with them. And when you mentioned about the confidence, the one in my doctoral work on this whole project, one of the things we were asking pastors, we were trying to measure, was self-reported changes in confidence and competency. And one of the reasons why pastors don't wade into these conversations, one of the reasons I didn't early in my senior pastoral ministry, is because I wasn't confident and I didn't know where to go next. And so in our trainings, the protocol is scripted. Here's what you say, here's what you can memorize, so that when you have it in front of you, even if the conversation gets off track, I want the couple to know and to feel, not in a hubris sense, I want them to know a couple things. One, you both matter to me right now. You matter infinitely to God, and whether or not you feel you can stay married, I just want you to know you matter to me. And it's important for me to hear your voice. But the second thing is, nobody's going to talk you in or out of anything. This is about clarity. And so we want to help try to bring down obviously there's other ways to do, this is best practices of counseling, but I want to communicate not just warmth, but you had mentioned this thing. I know what to do. If you'll walk with me and your goal is getting clarity on the options that are facing us so that we can make a prayerful, well-informed choice, I know how to get you there.
Yeah.
I know how to, and I will walk with you and it's going to be bumpy, it's going to be messy. That's okay. I'm used to all of that. And so then it's really a guided conversation, walking through three narratives, and each spouse gets to weigh in on their narrative. I maybe will explain it, maybe draw attention to it a little bit later. This can be done either sitting in an office just talking, or as I've come to the place where I like to let the couple draw out their marital distress and their story on what's called a marriage map. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But the dialogues we're gonna guide them through are, how did you get here? And I'll use language like this: Melody, help me understand in your own voice what's happened to your relationship over the period that you've been together to bring you to the place where you're in so much pain. And the same question to the husband, and then you listen. And if they're using the marriage map, they're actually using notation and symbols. And because I'm a visual person, it connects with me. It also relieves me of having to take copious notes, because the couple's telling me, they're putting down on paper. I think the other advantage, just as a side note, of using the marriage map, and if people are watching this and are interested, they can just go to my website, connect with me. I'll be happy to send them the version of it so they can look at it. But when they're drawing out their marital distress, oftentimes I find that it helps a couple, a spouse that's really in pain, helps them calm down, because they can see my turn's coming. I'm not going to get interrupted. I'm going to have Russ's full time for that 10 or 12 minutes to tell him from my perspective, and I'm not going to be cut off. I'm not going to be criticized. I'm not going to be corrected. And so as we put these layers, you can think of them as maybe overlays or layers of cellophane. So the first layer we put on is, how did you get here? The second layer is, what have you done along this timeline? Tell me about the places. We use just an RX symbol. Tell me about the places along your marriage journey where you have gotten help. And what was that experience like for you? And so in the training, we teach pastors and people in the marriage space and reconciliation coaches and marriage mentors just to kind of be listening, and to listen in a certain way. I want to be listening, on this question of, did you get help? There's only three answers to that question. One, we got help and it sucked. It was expensive. It made it worse. And so if a couple comes back and they're resistant to doing more counseling, we tried counseling. Hey, I understand that. Tell me about, what was that experience like for you? It could be that the chemistry between you and the therapist was not right. It could be your heart wasn't in the right place. It could be you had to drive an hour and a half. It could be all kinds of things. Appointments got canceled, all kinds of hurdles. It could be that it was too expensive. So just because a person hasn't gone to therapy, hasn't gone to a counselor, we should never infer that that equals resistance to working on their marriage. So how did you get here? The first option is, it was terrible, or the second option was, we got help, and but it didn't last. We went to counseling for 3 or 4 months, and then we went back to the same patterns. So I want to remember that, because I'm going to ask them about that later. Couples almost always interpret that as counseling didn't work. I want them to interpret it in exactly the opposite direction. So you mean to tell me that when you found a counselor you both connected with and you went to for 2 or 3 months, you were able to really make some progress? Yeah, our relationship was different, it was better, but it didn't last. That's always the thing that they tell. I go, there's all kinds of reasons why counseling does. When you have a sinus infection and they give you a 14-day prescription for antibiotics, what do a lot of us do who think that we're our own better doctors because of WebMD?
You take 5 days of it and then
we'll take it for 5 days and we'll stop. So it makes perfect sense to me. What I'm interested is not so much that you stopped. I mean, that's unfortunate. Would have been great to keep going. But I'm really curious about, when you got good help, you could make progress. Yeah. And so I'm dropping breadcrumbs of hope.
So then,
after this, now there's a very important question. The pastors and the therapists worked on honing the wording of this question, and it's about bringing the children, if they have children, into this decision-making process, because divorce is a very horrific, albeit sometimes regrettably necessary decision, but it is a life-altering event that kids don't get a voice in. And so we're going to ask the spouses each individually, you've told me about how you got here. You've told me about some of the times and ways. Oh, I'm sorry, I went too fast. The third option on the counseling, we got help and it sucked. We got help and it was good. The third was, we've never gone to counseling. And rather than kind of in my mind go, you didn't give a rip about your marriage, you didn't go to counseling, you live in San Antonio, for goodness sake. Marriage family initiatives are dripping all over San Antonio. I want to go in the opposite direction and not shame them because they didn't go to counseling, they didn't reach out for help. I want to step back and help and look at their pain narrative and make this observation. Boy, that must have been incredibly hard. I can't imagine how hard this has been for the two of you to have gone through everything you have shared with me and not have gotten the help that you needed. So after that, then there's this transitional question about the children, and it's worded like this. What role do your children play in your decision-making about the future of your marriage? And it's intentionally open, it's intentionally non-condemning. We don't go in the direction of saying, although it's true, haven't you guys read the literature on how bad divorce is for our kids? Certainly your kids ought to be a reason. We want, at this stage, if in triage, this would be like if you were a medical first responder and you found a guy or a gal on a motorcycle accident, and you're the first on the scene, and after you get them separated from the mangled motorcycle, you start in on a lecture of why they should have worn a helmet. Okay,
that's not what they need right then.
Your job is to help give them some hope and to get them to the hospital in one piece so that they can get more help. So we just leave that question out there, and parents have very different answers to that question. We just receive it. I may talk to them a little bit later about that individually, but we just receive it. Then we ask actually the last layer, the third layer of dialogue. And it seems like a left turn, so we've got to kind of prep them a little bit and say, I know this, we've been talking about really hard stuff, and this is a great chance for me to not, again, affirm the courage that it takes for two things. They've been self-controlled. I really appreciate you guys have sat here in a very difficult meeting doing some of the hardest emotional and spiritual work you can, and yet you've been very respectful of each other and of me. I just want to thank you for that. I get it. Mel and I have yelled at each other. We know how that feels. I just want to affirm that I'm just so thankful for the way in which you guys have been leaning into this. But now let me ask a question that feels different. Talk to me about the best times in your relationship. And in counseling psychology, this is called exceptionalism. Talk to me about times along this journey of your marriage that are an exception to what you're experiencing in your marriage now. And so when we do the marriage map, we haven't put smiley faces. And it's not about how long it is, because and you just understand this. The leaning out spouse, they're going to minimize the smiley faces. Why? Because their narrative that they have been building is that the marriage is terrible, it's not savable, I'm out. That gives them permission to leave the marriage. We just want to gently challenge that. I understand when you're desperate, that is a perfectly rational, not helpful, not spiritual decision. But that decision of I need to pull the ripcord, I need to get out of this relationship, makes sense given your pain. We just want to make sure that they've actually taken time to look back over the season of marriage that they've had and ask themselves this question: when were we getting along a little bit better? And sometimes we get responses like, well, it's never been really good. Yeah, you know what? I understand. Looking back now, our thinking is maybe kind of clouded by the pain we're in. That makes sense to me. But talk to me about any place along this journey that has been a little bit better. Times when God has shown up, times when you guys felt. And so sometimes they'll say before the kids came, and I'll go, oh boy, does that make sense to me? A lot of the national surveys and marital satisfaction, when do you think that they plummet?
Right.
So the
When you
first
have those
child
kids.
comes, and it's so counterintuitive. We love our kids. We thought this is what families, and it's what sociologists call time famine. We're both working full time. We're trying to raise children, and our best efforts go into our job and to our kids. And we end up oftentimes becoming better parents than partners. We put our us on the side thinking we'll get to this later, but we don't have any energy. We don't have any time left. And so sometimes as couples look at that, we just want to plant the seed of two things. One, it makes sense, but maybe you're looking at your relationship in a totally negative way. And it might be more helpful just, as the scripture says in Romans 12, let us think not more highly of himself than we ought. Think soberly, think with sober judgment. Don't make problems in your marriage bigger or smaller than they are. Don't make the good times bigger or smaller, but don't be really quick to paint everything in a gray tone, everything in a dark, dark blue. And we want to give them it's just basically touching this narrative. And oftentimes, even a leaning in spouse is discouraged. That they're on their feet; they feel like they're on the verge of divorce. The leaning out spouse feels like I'm on the verge of freedom. So why would I lean in to talk about the good times in my marriage? There's a body of research that shows one of the main ways of getting at this divorce ambivalence, not to manipulate it, but to stir what I call positive ambivalence.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where these smiley faces fit. I'm not even sure if these smiley faces add up to a happy marriage. I'm ambivalent about it, but at least it's stirring positive ambivalence that then the Holy Spirit and you, as you're thinking about your decision of what to do with your marriage, may be a helpful factor. Oftentimes couples on this journey too, as they're mapping this out, it makes perfect sense to them now visually. Oh, that smiley face was when our first kid came home, but we were really on the same page. We hadn't moved into a house yet where we had a huge house payment. We were just in an apartment. We had enough, but we were so happy to be this little family. Oftentimes couples will indicate other life events that then when they look at it, you'll hear phrases like, I didn't know. I'd forgotten you were going through that while I was. This is called the vertical narrative.
Yeah.
I forgot how hard you were working to finish your degree when I was trying to do this. There may be not excuses. I call these little empathy windows. There may be very understandable reasons why we're at the place we're at, why we missed each other emotionally, why we missed each other spiritually. I had one couple that in their marital distresses, they mapped this out. All of the smiley faces lined up for both of them. Couple was very mobile. They had a lot of moving, a lot of jobs. I think one of them was in the military, a little bit of deployment, stateside. They said, we just thought of it now, but the smiley faces on our marriage map are places where we got plugged into a good church. It's where we had support. It's where, in other places, because we move, our family doesn't move with us. Oftentimes a year or two, we didn't get the chance to meet and develop strong friendships. We felt like we couldn't put down roots. But when we were in an area and we connected and began to bond, we're in community, it made some of our marital distress easier, and it sort of normalized some of it. We were bumping up against couples who are going, yeah, us too.
Oh, Dr. Berg, that is such a huge takeaway for our marriage champions to think about what they can do, both in the topic we're talking about, but then on the enrichment side, where that can make that difference. And that's a huge example and a takeaway and evidence that what they're doing on the enrichment side is also very, very important.
Absolutely. In fact, out of the three things that we as the body of Christ need to do, we need to start couples well by good premarital education. We need to strengthen them as they're growing, helping good marriages get better. And then we need a safety net when they struggle, because they're almost all going to struggle. But that marriage mentoring, that marriage enrichment piece oftentimes can be the thing that even if a couple doesn't have a destructive marriage, they may have a difficult marriage. And that distinction between the two, they're going through a difficult time. Having that marriage enrichment there for them, that and accessible, helps them sometimes drop anchor in a church emotionally and spiritually and say, this is where we're home. We're gonna walk our journey here. I've known people that actually have regretted taking business promotions because as it moved them, it made sense financially. It didn't make any sense spiritually or relationally for themselves, their marriage, and their kids.
Wow. That is so huge. Well, as they're going on, I know you're trying to, this discernment counseling process, it's what, like an hour and a half with a couple? It's just one or two sessions, right? Because you're trying
sometimes it's 90, it's at least 90 minutes. I know that there are other counselors and therapists that go longer. I try to remember when a couple's coming to me at like 7:00, they've worked a full day. They've gotten their kids out, they've gotten a sitter, they picked up something to eat quickly, and they're tired. And so to expect them to stay engaged for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, what ends up happening is when you've exhausted that window of my best self, now my not so good self kicks in, and I'm cranky. I'm not really as responsive. I'm not as cooperative, and it makes sense. So I try to limit it to 90 minutes unless they want to go longer. But in that first session, we want to walk through these narratives we've talked about. And then I want to end that session by suggesting to them, here are your options. And if you think of one, I always kind of do this, and it just is kind of my style. I do this with humility. Guys, you may have an option I just never thought of. Please feel free to suggest it. But as I'm looking at your story, and again, affirming them for this work, thank you for telling me how important your kids are in this decision-making process. I want to just lay out for you what I think are your options for you guys to consider. And you don't need to tell me which one you are focused on right now. I just want you to think about them and then tell me if they make sense to you. And so on the marriage map, we've got 3 arrows. We call them paths. But if we're just talking, you can use whatever language. We have it's scripted in the manual. And then as you do this more, you can use your own. But we would basically I would basically go into a brief explanation mode of, path 1 is you could stay the same. Don't change anything and hope something changes. And I know that, everybody says, well, that's the definition of insanity, not changing anything and hoping you're going to get different results. But there's a body of research that actually indicates that some couples feel like their marital distress is a speed bump. They hit it, they're going to get over it, they're going to keep going. And couples they described themselves before this as being really unhappy. 5 years later, they were relatively happy. They just survived, okay? That's an option. The second option is you could intentionally or unintentionally slide towards separation or divorce. I'm not saying that because I advocate that. But I'm saying it because, Melody, you've raised it. You've said you're frustrated, and divorces for you guys is on the table. And in Minnesota, divorce is on the table. We're a no fault, no waiting period state. So that in some counties, you can, in Hennepin County, if the court calendar isn't super clogged, you can finalize a divorce in 90 to 120 days. I've had Christian attorneys tell me, Russ, if there are no contested assets and no children involved, I can finalize a divorce in 45 days. So what may have taken you 14 years to build can be deconstructed in 45 days. So it's on the table. And I just want you to know that I know it's on the table. And I want to be just really clear that this is your decision, but I want to acknowledge this as an option. But then there's the third option, which we call the pause path, or the pause button. You as a couple could choose to postpone a final decision about the future of your marriage and take 6 months with the best help available to see if there's hope. It's not a guarantee to stay married forever. You'd have a common understanding and a common commitment through a covenant to say we're both gonna bring our best self. We're both gonna try as hard as we can. If it's not working, we're gonna raise our hand and go, something's not right here. But you're not locked into like a year of counseling. And the expectation is not that you're gonna stay married forever, because you're not there. That makes perfect sense given the marital distress you are experiencing. We just want you to know that you have the choice to make a decision to put this distress not on hold, because you're going to be working on some of this, but it's going to be tentative. 6 months is usually more than enough time for each spouse to develop, to actually bring forth whether or not they are willing and able to make the kind of choices that will lead toward the marriage become. And so in the Christian realm, the goal that you are looking to see if you can make progress toward is a marriage that has two characteristics. It's very simple. It glorifies God by using the wisdom of Scripture. We don't have to make marriage up as we go along. God's given us plenty of wisdom. But secondly, it's a marriage that's good for both of you. And oftentimes our marriages have become good for one person, and they want to protect that. They want the status quo to keep going. Has this been pretty good for them? Or the marriage has become good for neither of them. And oftentimes couples will use this kind of language. We don't hate each other. We hate what our marriage has become. We hate what our us has become.
And when you get them to just say, 6 months isn't forever, that doesn't have to mean you've agreed to just be miserable. It means you're agreeing to take time. And two, if there's some hard problems, affairs, addictions,
right,
that person can receive the separate help.
And they're still going to make, you still have to make a decision at the end of the 6 months as to whether or not you feel there's been enough progress in the direction, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And so you're still in the control. Control is not actually the right word. A lot of times couples feel like, I'm going to go to a counselor and they're going to do all this stuff. I just check the boxes, and I mix the secret sauce and I kind of spread it on and things get better. And I'm not really in control of the process. In discernment counseling and in reconciliation coaching, you not only have homework and hard work, but out of those 3 paths, it's painful to stay the same and wait for change. It's painful to go through separation or divorce, and it's painful to work on your marriage. But for all of those 3 endeavors, I would want to suggest to the couple, the one that may actually have a reward for your hard work is working on your marriage for 6 months. Hopefully, God willing, in the end of 6 months, you'll say, everything's not perfect, but I look at my marriage differently. I look at my spouse differently. I didn't realize that both of us were in such a negative spin. Or, of course, we want to keep working on other things. Our children have noticed the difference. Our friends have noticed the difference. It's gotten a little bit better every time we've met. Or you may come to the end of 6 months and you may say, we worked as hard as we know how with really good help. And we're going to have to stand before God someday and go, I don't know why it didn't go back together. I think God's grace is going to cover. I have great respect for any couple that will engage the hard work to see if there's hope, because it also allows them not only to have the dignity and the self-respect. I loved God enough. I took God's truth seriously enough that before I pull the ripcord, I want to give time for God to show up, not only in our marriage, but in me. Secondly, if I have children and I have to sit down and have this hard conversation about mom and dad aren't going to live together, with integrity, if I've really worked hard, I can have a conversation with my children. Kids, I don't know why. Mom and I worked as hard as we knew how for 6 months. We still can't figure out why it hasn't gone back together. But we want you to know you were worth fighting for, not fighting over. We know that this is going to have stuff that is going to turn your world upside down. We're going to go to counseling and work as hard as we can to minimize that. But we want you to know you are worth us fighting for you and fighting for our marriage, not fighting over in litigation.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Berg, that is just a beautiful inspiration. And of course, we all hope as marriage champions that it'll be the first outcome, that the 6 months
Absolutely.
of working hard moves them in a better place. And I just love that you have this wonderful roadmap, both for couples and for our marriage champions and our pastors, to learn how to do this discernment counseling, this faith-based counseling, to provide those options for clarity and just to really in a confident and Christ-like way. And of course, you have all this information, trainings, manuals, resources for you on your website at To Restored. And for our marriage champions, you can always find these things at samarriage.org.